everyone. Welcome to the opening event of the 8th Annual Israeli Apartheid Week. My name is Samantha, and I'd like to thank you all for coming. Students for Justice in Palestine at NYU is a diverse group of students organized on democratic principles to promote justice, human rights, liberation, and self-determination for the Palestinian people. For the past year, SJP at NYU has been deeply involved with a divestment campaign targeting primarily U.S. corporations that are perpetuating and profiting from Israel's illegal and immoral occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Israeli Apartheid Week is an annual international series of events held in cities and campuses across the globe. The aim of IAW is to educate people about the nature of Israel as an apartheid system and to build boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaigns as part of a growing global BDS movement. The call to BDS, made in July 2005 and issued by 170 Palestinian civil society organizations, demands the following: full equality for Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel, an end to the occupation and colonization of all Arab lands, including the Golan Heights, the occupied West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, and dismantling the wall, and the protection of Palestinian refugees' right to return to their homes and properties as stipulated in UN Resolution 194. Tonight, our distinguished panelists are Omar Barghouti and Noor Arafat. Omar Barghouti is an independent Palestinian commentator and human rights activist. He is a founding member of the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel and the Palestinian Civil Society Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions, or BDS campaign against Israel. This is his book, Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, The Global Struggle for Palestinian Rights. It is actually available in the back among other groups and other books, and all proceeds go to the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel. Noor Arafat is a Palestinian attorney and activist. She is currently an adjunct professor of international human rights law in the Middle East at Georgetown University and legal advocacy coordinator for the Badil Center for Palestinian Refugee and Residency Rights. As you know, tonight's panel is called Apartheid in Israel-Palestine, Legality and Morality. Apartheid is a strong word, but we shouldn't shy away from the truth. Tonight we'll find out why. So, without further ado,
what I'd like to do is give you a background of the laws that underpin and that form the Israeli apartheid system. It's a bit of legalese, but I hope that you'll follow with me. What I attempt to do is something that I did on behalf of the Badil Resource Center for Palestinian Refugee and Residency Rights. It's an NGO located in Bethlehem that does its advocacy work here in New York, in Washington, D.C., as well as in Geneva, and organizes Palestinian refugees globally. The purpose of our submission was to, before the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, in the report, we demonstrate that Israel maintains a policy of distinguishing its Jewish nationals from its Israeli citizens. And upon this distinction, it implements a policy of forced population transfer, not just in the occupied territories, but also within Israel proper, predominantly, as we know now, as is seen in the Prar plan, in the Bedouins in the south, Bedouin Palestinian Israelis in the south, as well as throughout Israel itself by preventing the return of Palestinian refugees. We argue that this policy of forced population transfer upon this distinction constitutes and triggers the Apartheid Convention, specifically Article 2C and 2D, therefore demonstrating that Israel has a singular system of apartheid that extends from within Israel proper to the occupied territories and beyond. We make recommendations, but I doubt that those are relevant here. But the reason that this is relevant is that it was before the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination just a couple of weeks ago. Before I begin with the discussion of law, to make what type of law are we discussing? International law has many different facets and many that apply to the conflict today. The two that we're most concerned with are the laws of war, or humanitarian law, and the laws of peace, or human rights law. The idea is that in wartime, those laws of peace, or human rights law, no longer need to be adhered to. Instead, humanitarian law applies, which are much more narrow in scope, and they represent the bare minimum that Israel must comply with. This is specifically relevant because of the nature of the occupation. Occupation triggers the Fourth Geneva Convention and therefore humanitarian law. In that case, the entirety of the Fourth Geneva Convention should apply to the territories and mandates that the occupying power return to the status quo ante as fast as possible in order to revert to a peacetime of stability. The problem in the case of Israel is that this belligerent occupation, which should be 5 to 10 years in its short-term nature, has actually extended in the terms of the 67 occupation to 45 years, making it a prolonged occupation. In a prolonged occupation, the laws that are violated are not necessarily just ones of occupation and the end of occupation, but have actually created a system where there is discrepancy between populations and distinctions between them, in this case, namely, Jewish nationals and Palestinian citizens. And because of that, human rights law applies as well. And so those that argue, well, this is an occupation, only the Fourth Geneva should apply, and the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination shouldn't, the fact of the matter is that both apply. The discussion that I'll be sharing with you is specifically about human rights law because of the prolonged nature of Israel's occupation. With that, I'll begin by sharing with you a little bit about Israel's own guarantee of equality to all of its citizens. Israel doesn't have a constitution to speak of. It did in 1992 legislate a basic law on human dignity and liberty. But notably, paragraph 10 of the basic law, which guarantees human dignity and liberty, is not applied retroactively. What does that mean for Israel? It means that all the laws that have been legislated up and between 1948 and 1992, including the absentee property law, which specifically targets Palestinians, as well as the law of return, which specifically privileges Jewish nationals, are not triggered and subject to review because of the basic law on human dignity and liberty. Therefore, there is no retroactive application, and within Israel, there is no constitutional right to equality, meaning that those Palestinian Israeli citizens are not equal. There's another point to be made about Israel's self-proclaimed nature as a Jewish and a democratic state. To be both Jewish and democratic puts two serious concepts into conflict with one another. And as the High Court of Justice of Israel, or its Supreme Court, has ruled consistently, as well as its politicians, when these two principles are in context and are at tension, Israel's Jewish nature trumps its democratic one. And this speaks to also the continuing discrimination of its non-Jewish national population. What does this proposition mean to be Jewish and democratic in light of this context? It means three things. The first is that the Jewish people must form the majority of the state at all times by any means necessary. So to maintain a Jewish majority in a land where in 1947 Jews did not constitute a majority but instead a minority means that the rights of the indigenous population are consistently abridged. It also means in a country where the natural population growth of 20% of Israel's population will naturally, by 2025, according to some studies, outnumber the Jewish population. It puts Israel in a position where it must implement policies to reduce its non-Jewish population. And during this presentation, I'll share with you some of the laws by which it does that. The second is that Jews are entitled to preferential treatment, most notable of which is the law of return. This is also meant to maintain a demographic majority. That the law of return affords, and we'll discuss this as well, all Jewish persons the right to claim Israeli citizenship and to residency rights to live within Israel actually makes them, Jews anywhere in the world, have greater rights than those Palestinian citizens who were born and raised in Israel and have been there for generations. The third proposition is that a reciprocal relationship exists between the state and any Jewish persons living outside of its borders. Again, the idea that your participation in a national body as a citizen does not entitle you to protection from the state and to any privileges vis-a-vis the state's nationals who are proclaimed here as Jewish. So what Israel did by passing this law in 1952 was to denationalize all Palestinians, making them effectively stateless, which is a violation of many different human rights laws, including Article 13 of the UDHR, which affords every person the right to a nationality. And it's a violation of customary law to do so. Israel is not unique for implementing these policies. Just to be clear, many states have these horrible practices, though Israel's practice is notable because of its prolonged nature and the fact that it has been able to circumvent international law and be afforded unequivocal U.S. financial, military, and economic support. But, for example, Syria in 1982 also denationalized 200,000 of its Kurdish citizens of Syrian nationality. Here's the chart. See why it's so important? I would have tried to explain it to you, but I don't know if I would have gotten the same points across. So the point to take across from here, and we'll be going through this in the presentation, but the point is that nationality and citizenship are distinguished. Nationality affords the rights of Jewish nationals to enter Israel at any time, to obtain citizenship at any time, and to live in Israel or in the settlements or any other place, frankly, that the Jewish nationals please, so long as it's within the purview of the Israeli state. Who is a Jewish national? According to the nationality law, a Jewish national is someone who was born of a Jewish mother or has become converted to Judaism and is not a member of any other religion. The rights of this nationality are vested in children, grandchildren, spouses of Jewish persons, and unless a Jewish person voluntarily changed their religion. The laws that are afforded or that control Jewish national rights within Israel include their full spectrum of civil and political rights. They're subject to Israeli civil and criminal law. They can bring their spouses to settle in Israel or in the occupied territory. Jewish nationals living in the occupied territory have this same spectrum of rights, notwithstanding the fact that the settlements themselves are illegal per Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, as well as Article 147 of Fourth Geneva, which constitutes it as a war crime, as well as the Rome Statute, Article 7 and 8, which deem the transfer of one civilian population into the territory it occupies a war crime. And so, notwithstanding that, they have all the rights afforded to Israeli citizens and nationals. And the rights are also afforded to Jewish nationals living abroad. So it's the extraterritorial application of this law that makes it quite unique and renders the citizens, the Palestinian citizens of Israel who are not nationals, as second class even to those who are not within the country. This is quite unheard of. So the U.S., for example, maintains plenary power to reject the entry of any persons to enter its borders. But once you're within the U.S., you have certain rights that are constitutionally guaranteed rights about due process that would limit the way that the U.S. can deport you, for example. And yet, and in the U.S., nationality and citizenship are one. Of course, there's many tiered layers of who is a citizenship plus. That's a different discussion. But no, it does not have a distinction between nationality and citizenship. Now, moving on to Palestinians who are Muslim and Christian, atheist and otherwise, they do not have Jewish nationality and are not eligible for Jewish nationality under any circumstances. Worse than that is that they are partitioned into several different groups, to each to which corresponds a different part of Israeli law. One, this creates a matrix of control of the Palestinians wherever they may live. But secondly, it works to fragment the Palestinian national body so that it never necessarily comprises a holistic whole that can therefore advocate for its self-determination as enshrined by Article 1 of the ICCPR and the ICESCR, or the Covenants on Civil and Political Rights and Economic, Social, Cultural Rights. So the different categories are those Palestinians who are in East Jerusalem. To those Palestinians in East Jerusalem, they do not have citizenship, despite the fact that Israel unilaterally annexed East Jerusalem in 1980 in contravention of political will and international law. That annexation has not been recognized, and it's not even been recognized by the US, which has not transferred its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So they've been brought under, by unilateral annexation, Israel's purview, but have been denied Israeli citizenship. Instead, they've been afforded Israeli residency. What does that mean? It means that as residents, their residency rights are tenuous and easily revoked. Consider that between 1967 and 2010, Israel revoked the residency of 13,115 Palestinians from East Jerusalem without due process. It was revoked in something called silent deportation, and those Palestinian residents were never able to challenge or contest the revocation. This puts them in a different status, and will show how this facilitates their forced population transfer from East Jerusalem. But it also puts them in a different status from their citizen counterparts, as well as the rest of Palestinians. Those Palestinian citizens of Israel can only live in Israel, but unlike the settlers, cannot live in the occupied territories. For them, unlike the Jewish nationals who can marry someone from anywhere and can obtain residency and citizenship for them within Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel who marry Palestinians, say from the West Bank or Gaza or Syria or Lebanon, where many Palestinians live, if they are, for example, studying abroad in Canada, studying abroad in the US, or somehow working together on a project, they happen to fall in love, they want to live in Israel, they are not afforded that right of family reunification, not just by an Israeli law, the ban on family reunification, also known as the Temporary Amendment to the Citizenship and Entry into Israel law, but they are not afforded that right as declared by the Israeli Supreme Court recently on January 25th this year, 2012. And I'll be sharing with you some of the quotes that well, let me tell you a little bit about it now, because I'm not sure how much time I'm going to have. But the purpose, the reasoning for not allowing them this right to family reunification, according to Israel, is that those Palestinians who live in quote-unquote enemy territories or enemy states, including Syria, Lebanon, and the occupied Palestinian territory, constitute a security threat to Israel. There is a significant problem with this, because if they do constitute a security threat, they should be afforded the right to due process, a screening to determine on an individual basis who indeed is a security threat and who is not a security threat, and therefore make a determination on that basis. But Israel has made a sweeping declaration that there will be no review. They all constitute a security threat by matter of identity. So on the one hand, even in the best case that this was about security, they're not afforded due process in order to challenge whether or not they're indeed a security threat. On the other hand, consider that the Supreme Court itself has said, quote, "Human rights are not a prescription to national suicide." Obviously, human rights of Palestinians are not a prescription to national suicide. What is the reference to national suicide here specifically? It's about the demographic majority of Jewish persons within Israel. And so here, the Supreme Court is declaring that its nationhood is conditioned upon maintaining a majority of Jewish persons, and not conditioned upon territorial integrity, not conditioned upon a robust economy, not conditioned upon democracy and equality, but conditioned upon a demographic equation wherein Jews constitute a majority. And this is actually what drives the rest of these citizenship and nationality policies. Other members of the Knesset were much more explicit, considered that Yaakov Katz, the minister of the Knesset, said, quote, "The state of Israel was saved from being flooded by 2 to 3 million Arab refugees." So here you have a few things to consider. One, the denial of due process for those Palestinians who may or may not be a security threat. The second is that the Palestinian citizens of Israel, their rights to family reunification are abridged vis-a-vis their Jewish counterparts who are nationals and are not subject to the same laws, because this disproportionately affects those Palestinian citizens. And so it's also a civil rights issue. And 3, because of this law, it prohibits the possibility of reuniting refugees to their families who are still living within the State of Israel. And family reunification, historically, and it continues to be a mechanism to reunite refugees with their families, whether it be in Mozambique, or in Kosovo, or elsewhere. Moving on, citizenship, who is not even eligible for citizenship? Well, 1, the Palestinian residents of East Jerusalem, but also the rest of Palestinians, the refugees who constitute a 6.6 million person population, the Palestinians in the West Bank who hold IDs, and the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip who hold IDs, and even the territorial contiguity, or even the national contiguity of these territories is undermined by a recent military order, specifically 1649 and 1650, which I hope to share with you. How does this trigger an apartheid regime? According to the Apartheid Convention, there are 3 basic elements of the Apartheid Convention. 1, there must be a separation between two or more groups of people. 2, there must be an element of discrimination. And 3, there must be an element of domination. It exists in this case as we demonstrate that there is a domination of one group, Jewish nationals and citizens, over another group, Palestinian Arabs, within Israel, and in the OPT. This regime grants a superior legal and political status to all Jewish nationals wherever they may reside, in Israel, in illegal settlements throughout the territory, and even abroad. On the other hand, Palestinian Arabs have an inferior legal and political status, regardless of whether they live within Israel, regardless of whether they've been indigenous and have remained on the same plot of land for generations, or whether they live in the territory and Palestinian refugees have been, because they've been denationalized and denied their right to repatriation and return, are also subject to an inferior status. So we argue that this apartheid regime, whereas it may be more insidious because of its violent and illustrative nature in the occupied territory, that it also exists within Israel because of the distinction that it makes between Jewish nationals and the others who may, Jewish nationals and citizens on the one hand, and Palestinian citizens only on the other. And so the same policies that drive the Israeli state in the occupied territories mirror those policies that drive state policies within Israel proper, or the Green Line. How is this applied to return? As I mentioned, the law of return, all Jewish nationals are entitled to the law of return, meaning that they can claim citizenship and entry to Israel and residency rights, whereas the right of return, which is enshrined in General Assembly Resolution 194, which is also deemed a customary right, is denied to all those Palestinian indigenous persons who were expelled in 1948, subsequently in 1967, and currently constitute about 4 generations living in global diaspora and still within refugee camps in the Arab world. And there's a discussion to be had about the way that they're under a different refugee regime in international law as well, distinguishing the UNHCR versus the UNRWA, or the United Nations Relief Works Agency. I can discuss that if you're interested in the Q&A. In any case, the point here is that Palestinian non-Jewish nationals are excluded ipso facto from any benefits of the law. And the purpose of that exclusion is to maintain a demographic majority in order to avoid, in the words of the Israeli High Court of Justice, national suicide. Forced population transfer figures into this because based upon this distinction, Israel pursues a policy of forced population transfer, which is the legal term for ethnic cleansing. And it's well constituted in international law. It refers to a coercive set of policies or policy that contains 2 elements. And in the Israeli regime, these 2 elements are the forcible transfer of Palestinians or Arabs, and forcible transfer meaning not only forcible transfer from their own lands, but deportation as well as the implantation of a settler population, which facilitates their displacement. And second, and significantly, Forced population transfer is a war crime per the Fourth Geneva Convention, per the Rome Statute, per the Additional Protocol 1, which the U.S. has not ratified, but most of its provisions are considered customary in international law, as well as per the Apartheid Convention, which deemed apartheid a crime against humanity. Forced population transfer triggers two elements of the Apartheid Convention, namely Article 2C and Article 2D. I need not read them to you. I trust that you'll trust me on this, and happy to share the language with you about specifically the Apartheid Convention envisioned policies of the movement of populations in order to ensure separation, discrimination, and domination, and was considered a violation of the Apartheid Convention and what triggers the presence of apartheid on the land. This policy exists both within Israel proper as well as the occupied territory. In Israel proper, it's facilitated in several ways. I'll share with you just a few of them here. I've discussed with you the amendment to the Citizenship and Entry Law, which is the ban on family reunification. Really? Okay. I've discussed this with you, and let me briefly tell you about the Nakba Bill. The Nakba Bill was a law that was passed that imposes civil penalties upon those organizations or institutions that create memory for the law of return or even commemorate the Nakba or the catastrophe for Palestinians of their original displacement. So imagine, rather than per the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, rather than Israel comply with the convention and its recommendations, its committee recommendations, which is to encourage and facilitate the right of return, Israel has steadily moved in the opposite direction. Is this the right? No, that's the left. Has steadily moved in the opposite direction and has made even the memory of Nakba a crime. That even those Palestinian citizens within Israel cannot maintain their own memory. Imagine if here in the U.S. we made it illegal for Mexicans to commemorate the once broader Mexico in the Southwest, or more aptly, Native Americans and the indigenous population to commemorate their own presence on this land because it threatened our nationhood and would be a tantamount to national suicide. You can imagine how problematic it is, but the good news is that the Nakba Bill in its first iteration actually associated a criminal penalty of incarceration for 3 years, and that was rolled back in its fight. In any case, land acquisition for public ordinance is a mandate-era law. In its first iteration, it says that lands that are confiscated by the state belong to the state in perpetuity for public purposes, meaning that they will not belong to individuals. What does this recent law do? It's February 2010. It basically says that if the land has not been claimed or used for 17 years, that it can be sold to third-party individuals, meaning it can be sold to Jewish nationals, which makes it even more difficult for Palestinian refugees to ever make a claim for their original lands. Significantly, the absentee property law of 1950 declared that all lands that were not claimed in 1950 would belong to the state. It's a very troublesome law because it was juxtaposed against another policy to prevent any refugees, remotely or in person, to make claims for their original lands. So the law says if nobody claims it, it belongs to the state. But nobody can claim it because refugees can't return. And so, today, 93% of the lands within Mandate Palestine belong to the state for public purposes. Much of it may be sold now to individual Jewish national citizens and will be rendered even farther out of reach of those Palestinian refugees. Do I want to tell you anything else about that? Not right now, and I won't have time. Notably, the number of the immigration statistics between 2010 and 2011, as these laws are being passed, Jewish immigration into Israel has increased by 20% between 2010 and 2011. I don't have time to go through this, do I, Noah? No. Okay, well, let me tell you in sum. Can I summarize it? In sum, there is a different matrix of control and population transfer in East Jerusalem. And it's not just East Jerusalem and the occupied territory, but also the Jordan Valley, which constitutes 40% of the West Bank, Area C in the West Bank, which constitutes 62% of the West Bank, as well as within Israel in the south, or the Negev, known as the Negev Desert, where now pursuant to the prior plan, Israel will remove and displace 30,000 of its own citizens from the south in order to make room for a forest that will be planted by the Jewish National Fund. This is quite significant, I think, to everybody in this room, because the Jewish National Fund has a majority of seats in the Israeli Land Administration, or the Land Authority, which governs all of Israeli lands. So as a majority of the seats, it can determine what happens to Israeli land. But unlike the state, it is not subject to international human rights law and therefore can discriminate as a private entity. So Israel contracts out its discriminatory policies to the JNF in order to use land specifically and exclusively for Jewish persons. It's a parastatal organization. Relevance to us in this room are twofold. The first is that the JNF has been vying for special consultative status to ECOSOC, or the Economic, Cultural, and Social Council of the United Nations, or the body of all NGOs, for ECOSOC status to participate in the UN. And has been denied, but the US is now lobbying on its behalf to be included, although it's a parastatal organization. The second, it has and benefits from tax-exempt status in the US, or 501c3 status. Based on its parastatal nature, it violates US tax code, or IRS regulations for deception and fraud, making it a very useful and relevant target for BDS activities. Quickly about East Jerusalem. East Jerusalem Palestinians are residents and not citizens. They're subject to revocation of their residency rights much more easily. Discriminatory zoning and planning policies discriminate against the Palestinian population, so that I think it was, I'm not going to tell you the year, but when Palestinians applied for 1,500 new housing, 2010, Palestinians applied for 1,500 new housing units, they were only granted something like 142. What happens to the rest of the housing units that are built anyway for natural population growth? They're subject to home demolitions. But in the Israeli law, the home demolitions are legal and not discriminatory because those Palestinians didn't have permits to begin with. And then finally, the steady confiscation of Palestinian lands. So we didn't discuss Military Order 1650 or the annexation wall and its impact. I didn't plan on going through all this anyway. I knew I didn't have time, but I just want to show you a little bit, and we come back to this chart. Hence, Israel distinguishes between its Jewish nationals and its citizens, its Jewish national citizens versus its Palestinian citizens only. All other Palestinians, upon this basis, it implements a policy of forced population transfer that triggers apartheid throughout the entire region. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll speak about BDS, but I'll focus in this talk on the legacy of Mandela and King specifically, particularly given that this is Black History Month. Okay. Martin Luther King famously said, "The deep rumbling of discontent that we hear today is the thunder of disinherited masses, rising from dungeons of oppression to the bright hills of freedom. In one majestic chorus, the rising masses singing, ain't gonna let nobody turn us around." This is the moment we feel we're at in the BDS movement after less than 7 years of launching it. And Nelson Mandela said our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians. Indeed, the South Africans have been the absolute most important supporters of the BDS campaign worldwide. Just a brief history, geography. The map on your leftmost is the map of Palestine under British mandate. The next one is the partition plan map, with the yellow part being the so-called Arab state and the white part the so-called Jewish state. Arab and Jewish refers to what would have been the majority in either state, not that either state had the right to be exclusivist or racist and ethnically cleanse anyone else. This is in reality what happened in 1948 after the Nakba, with Israel being established on the entire white part, and we're left with the West Bank and Gaza, later occupied in 1967, and then we have the patches of white Jewish-only settlements, interspersing the yellow patches of what's left of the Palestinian homeland. According to the latest census of 2011, the number of Palestinians today is 11.22 million. 50% live outside of historic Palestine, that is Israel, West Bank, and Gaza. 12% are Palestinian citizens of Israel. 37 to 38% are in the West Bank and Gaza. Of the 38%, a whole 44% are refugees. 44% of the Palestinians in the OPT are refugees. So together, this makes the population of the percentage of refugees, 69% of the Palestinian population today are refugees, 31% are not refugees. So when anyone says, I support Palestinian rights, and therefore I want to end the occupation, they don't support Palestinian rights. They support most of the rights of 31%, 38%, those in the occupied territories, most of their rights. Most because many of them are refugees. So you're not supporting the right of return. So if you just support ending the occupation, you're supporting most of the rights of a minority of the Palestinian people, and you don't care about the basic, unsanctioned rights of the great majority, more than 2/3 of the Palestinian people. This is why the BDS called in 2005, when it came out 9 July 2005, called for the 3 basic rights of the 3 major components of the Palestinian people. Ending the 1967 occupation and colonization, including the wall and so on, ending apartheid in Israel, and I'll get to that. I know Noura made an excellent job explaining why it's apartheid, but there's some anecdotal information that I'll add to that. And then third and foremost, recognizing the rights of refugees to return in accordance with UN Resolution 194. As I said, refugees are 69% of the Palestinian people. And the call came out on July 9, 2005. It was no coincidence. It was the first anniversary of the International Court of Justice, ruling against Israel's wall and colonies. And that Palestinian civil society in 2005 reached the conclusion that under US hegemony, the international community is unable or unwilling or both to even make Israel stop constructing its wall on illegal occupied territories, illegally unoccupied territories, let alone helping us exercise our right to self-determination, which at a minimum would entail ending occupation, ending apartheid, and the right of return. So we cannot rely on the so-called international community under US hegemony. The main philosophy of BDS, if you will, is that moral right must and will prevail over military might. And it's not like we're living in a utopia. This happened in the civil rights movement in this country. This happened in South Africa. This is happening everywhere. Especially now with the Arab Spring, and I'll get to that, we have even much more belief that moral right can and will prevail over military might. So the BDS movement, which is a global rights-based movement, decentralized, but it's led by the BDS National Committee, which is the absolute largest coalition of Palestinian civil society groups. Because there's a lot of misunderstanding who's really doing this BDS among Palestinians. All political parties, all trade unions, all women's unions, all youth groups, all NGO networks, all refugee advocacy groups, and on and on and on. Just about every major group in Palestinian society is part of the BDS National Committee. This is the absolute largest coalition in Palestinian society. The 3 main slogans of BDS are freedom, justice, and equality, which makes it hardly a leftist agenda. And I've said this before, but I'll repeat it. Yes, we do expect leftists to support us, of course, naturally. They're our natural allies. But it's a liberal agenda. I mean, freedom, justice, and equality. Any self-respecting liberal should be able to support this. And there are many liberals who are not. So self-determination for the Palestinians, which is an inalienable right under international law, means at the very least ending the 3 forms of Israeli injustice: occupation, apartheid, and denial of refugee rights. That's the minimum to achieve self-determination. But is that a one-state agenda? I know somebody was planning to ask that question, so I'm going to answer it right now. No, it's not. In the BDS movement, we take no position on the one-state debate. Each one of us has his or her own view. I've advocated one state for 30 years, no secret, in English, Arabic, and every other language. But in the BDS movement, we don't have a position. In fact, people who support one state are a tiny, tiny, tiny minority, to be honest, unfortunately. The great majority of groups in the BDS National Committee are two-staters. The great majority, I mean, almost 99%. Really. Why is that? So why do we endorse those three basic rights? Does that bias the solution towards a one-state solution? Theoretically, no. If we think of it theoretically, in a two-state solution, that's conditioned upon international law, not dictated by the Israeli and US government. That's a repetition. So if we assume there's a two-state solution, neither state would have the right to be an apartheid state, theoretically. Neither a Palestine nor an Israel would have a right to be an apartheid state. Neither state can deny refugees their individual and collective right to return. That right is not extinguishable by whatever kind of government rules in that territory, be it Israel, Palestine, whatever. An individual right to return is not extinguished under any circumstances. Only the individual refugee has to decide, I don't want to return or I want to return. It's up to her or him only. So the basic issue is that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Basic, right? Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Not when it comes to Israel. Many supposed liberals would consider equality in Israel as suicide, like Noura mentioned, as a total disaster. And as I.F. Stone, the famous Jewish American writer, said, Israel is creating a moral schizophrenia among world Jewry. In the countries where they live, in the West, they're defending a democratic, secular, egalitarian model, and in Israel, they're defending a model that's racist, exclusivist, and discriminates between Jew and non-Jew. And I.F. Stone wrote that in 1967 with really a prophetic vision. So talking about 1967, the first part of BDS, ending the occupation. The occupation takes many forms. Saying it's an occupation really makes it look so banal. So what's an occupation? From settlements in and around Jerusalem to very racist expressions by Jewish settlers, Arabs to the gas chambers in Hebron, Al-Khalil, to the siege of Gaza and the bombing of Gaza in end of 2008, early 2009, which UN Rapporteur Richard Fogg said constituted acts of genocide. And in that war on Gaza, Israel used white phosphorus against a UN shelter, among others, which was used as shelter for families, mainly women and children. And as you probably know, white phosphorus, you cannot extinguish it. If it falls on a person, they're burnt alive. Amnesty International, after the war in Gaza, issued an excellent report titled Thirsting for Justice, where it accused Israel of using water as a means of expulsion of the Palestinians, particularly from Area C, which is the most fertile, more than 60% of the West Bank, which is the most fertile land with most of the water aquifers. And Amnesty talked about water, denial of clean water to Palestinians in Gaza, where 90 to 95% of the water supply is contaminated and unfit for human consumption. Israeli battalions, army battalions and platoons and so on compete who can design the most abrasive, racist t-shirt. And these are popular t-shirts among Israeli battalions, army battalions. This particular t-shirt has a supposedly pregnant Palestinian woman with crosshairs on her belly, and the slogan says in English, "One shot, two kills." Another t-shirt has an Israeli soldier raping a Palestinian girl, and underneath it says, "No virgins, no terror attacks." That was revealed in Haaretz, a long report, I think in 2007. And using Palestinian children as human shields, which was exposed by Palestinian, Israeli, and international human rights organizations. And one such case became famous when a 13-year-old boy had his arm tied to an Israeli army jeep to prevent his colleagues from throwing stones at the occupation jeep. And the infamous wall, which is reproducing the ghetto. But even if we forget occupied territories and we talk about Israel itself, as Noura As Noura mentioned, even in Israel itself, it qualifies as an apartheid state. It has two separate laws applying to its Jewish and non-Jewish citizens, as was explained. Recently, the Russell Tribunal on Palestine, which is a civil society tribunal, in its latest session in Cape Town, it had jurists, among its jurists were Alice Walker, Ronnie Castrill's Jewish South African, who was part of the Mandela government, the first freedom government in South Africa, and many, many other luminaries, reached the conclusion that Israel's rule over the Palestinian people, wherever they reside, this is the key, wherever they reside, collectively amounts to a single integrated regime of apartheid. That's a legal statement by the Russell Tribunal. South African Christian leaders, in their response to a Palestinian Christian theological document called Kairos Palestine, which I'll refer to later, had this interesting statement that was the first clause in their letter in response to the Kairos Palestine document. They said, from our own experience with apartheid, we can clearly and without equivocation say that the Palestinian situation is in essence the same as apartheid, and in its practical manifestation even worse than South African apartheid. And as Edward Said said, equality or nothing. That's the most basic right for the Palestinian people, the right to have equal rights. So I won't mention the 93%, which Noura mentioned, but this is one of the manifestations of this apartheid, that somebody who's born in Israel, lived there for a long, long time, if they're not Jewish, they cannot own land, they cannot live, they cannot lease land, or 93% of the area of Israel, because the Jewish National Fund has majority control. Another manifestation is what was done to Palestinian houses of prayer. As many of you know, during the Nakba, the 1948 ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, the majority of the Palestinian people, more than 500 villages were destroyed, systematically bulldozed to the ground. Some of them well after the Nakba. Many houses of prayer were destroyed. This particular church was not destroyed. It's a Roman Catholic church in Ma'lul, a village in what's now the north of Israel. It was turned into a cattle shed until 2005. But this mosque in Ain Hawd in Haifa was even less fortunate. It was turned into a bar restaurant and still is a bar restaurant with its Muslim community. Cannot claim it. Ain Hawd is a particularly difficult case in Israel's ethnic cleansing. Unlike the 500 plus other villages that were destroyed and bulldozed to the ground, Ain Hawd, which is one of the most picturesque, beautiful villages near Haifa, was not bulldozed. Instead, the houses were confiscated, people were ethnically, Palestinians were ethnically cleansed, and it was turned into a Jewish colony, artist colony. So today, many of the Ain Hawd residents, the Palestinians, are outside their village, living in a refugee camp inside Israel. They're citizens of the state of Israel, watching their village, their beautiful houses, every single day occupied by strangers. This must be even worse than Ain al-Hilwa in Lebanon. And al-Araqib, Noura mentioned the systematic destruction of Palestinian so-called unrecognized villages, Bedouin villages in the Naqab, the Negev desert, to ethnically cleansing them increasingly, sometimes using JNF to plant trees and whatever, just to ethnically cleanse the Bedouin community to maintain Israeli official control over the entire land. Another aspect of the Nakba that many people do not know of, and here we have Hannah Mermelstein, who wrote an excellent article on this, but thanks to a Jewish Israeli researcher at Ben-Gurion University, many details were revealed that Israel during the Nakba systematically pillaged, stole tens of thousands of Palestinian books from libraries, private homes, and so on, and destroyed them. And this scholar called it a cultural massacre, unparalleled by anything the French or the British imperial powers had done before. So we talked about the occupation, we talked about apartheid. The third and foremost right is the right of return. Palestinian refugees are not allowed back because of their religion, ethnicity. What does this have to do with you? Okay, some of you are in solidarity, they're committed morally and so on. But to answer this general question, why should this concern an average American? There are two issues. There's the general ethical commitment to international solidarity, and I just will share with you an anecdote, and I might have shared it before. When I was at Columbia University, I was in the anti-apartheid movement. And I used to demonstrate holding signs, abolish apartheid. And once a fellow engineer, you know, I was an engineering student, and engineers tend to be boxed. So a fellow engineer asks me, why are you wasting your time? Do you think apartheid will be abolished in your lifetime? I said, no, it won't. But it's a moral obligation. He said, but you're Palestinian. Don't you have enough to demonstrate about? So I said, yeah, but a victory in South Africa is a victory for us. A victory for blacks in the US in the civil rights movement is a victory for us. I see humanity as connected. Whenever, anywhere, we succeed against imperial hegemony, against racism, against colonial powers, it's a success for all of us. A recent Brown University study found out that the US spent $4 trillion in the last 10 years on its wars, decimating Iraq, Afghanistan, and other places, and causing the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people in those countries, plus thousands of American servicemen and women. And we all know what this money was used for, liberating children and women and whatnot. In general, the view is that we, in the Global South, are relative humans. We're not human in the full sense of the term. We're only human in the relative sense. So we do not deserve the full set of rights. If you're not a full human, you don't get full human rights that Noura was talking about. That applies to humans, not to us, Iraqis, Palestinians, Lebanese, Afghans, and so on. But racism abroad nourishes racism at home and feeds from racism at home. What does Israel have to do with this? Mersheimer concluded that Israel's lobby, the neocons in particular, the Israel lobby was a critical factor behind the US war on Iraq. But to say that and stop as if the war on Iraq was motivated only by serving Israeli interests would be absolutely inaccurate. It's as if there is no military-industrial complex in this country that was itching for war because it's good business. All the military contractors and the oil companies and the banks, they benefit from war. So Israel is good for them. So when some pundits say we should spend billions on Israel, the US that is, should send billions to Israel every year because it serves US interests. What US interests does it serve? It does. It serves the interests of the 1%, not the 99%. Israel is excellent if you're in the death business. Israel is really good for you because it conducts a war every other year, testing US weaponry, and it's very good for the US weapons industry. While it gets billions and billions of dollars, most of this money comes back to US military contractors. That's where it's spent. And forget Mersheimer and Walt, Philip Zelikow, the executive director of 9/11 Commission, so somebody high up in the US establishment, said the real threat from Iraq was not a threat to the US, the unstated threat was the threat against Israel. And today we see an Iraq 2.0. They're doing it again with Iran, fabricating stories about weapons of mass destruction and so on, as if Israel is not the only nuclear power in that whole region, as if it doesn't have already hundreds of nuclear weapons and has nutcases leading it. Despite this, the US decided in 2009 to spend $30 billion extra on top of everything else Israel is getting, $30 billion more in military aid, despite all what Israel has done. And if you look at the numbers, according to the US campaign to end the Israeli occupation did this excellent interactive map. According to those numbers, New York's share of this $30 billion for the next 10 years would be $2.5 billion. New York State would spend $2.5 billion supporting Israel's war crimes, instead of 30,500 affordable housing units for New Yorkers. Or instead of 74,000 sustainable green jobs. Or instead of 2 million primary health care for the uninsured. But why is that? Because as Desmond Tutu says, Israel is placed on a pedestal in this country. And to criticize it is to be immediately dubbed anti-Semitic, as if the Palestinians were not Semitic, he says. People are scared in this country to say wrong is wrong, so they stay silent. But silence is complicity. Your tax money is oppressing us. Silence is not an option, because our oppression has "Made in the USA" written all over. But somebody might say, yeah, but we want peace. We don't really want to support this boycott, and so we really want peace. Well, to the oppressed, that's a totally meaningless term if it's not associated with justice. Peace without justice just perpetuates injustice. And it's not enough to give us more crumbs and to make the master a bit nicer and expecting us to be happier slaves. Because as Desmond Tutu said, we do not want our chains comfortable, we want them removed. So BDS is very inspired by the anti-apartheid movement led by Mandela, by the civil rights movement led by King, and by Gandhi's legacy of nonviolent resistance. But first and foremost, it is deeply rooted in Palestinian heritage of popular civil resistance. For 100 years, this was the mainstay of Palestinian resistance against settler colonialism, occupation, and apartheid. You don't hear about it in the New York Times, in CNN, or in Fox News. You won't hear about it. But predominantly, Palestinian society resisted settler colonialism mainly through nonviolent civil means. From demonstrations, big popular demonstrations, nonviolent, in Jaffa in 1933 against the British mandate and the onslaught of settler colonialism, to artistic and cultural resistance, Mahmoud Darwish and Bursaid, and the music and dance and theater and everything else we've been doing for decades as part of our resistance is never mentioned. To our academics and students, this is a particularly important demonstration at Birzeit University. Some of you might recognize some faces there, Gabi Baramki, Hanan Ashrawi, and others, and thousands of academics and students. What they were demonstrating against is the closure of Birzeit University. Soon after the first Intifada broke out in 1987, Israel shut down all Palestinian universities. Then they shut down all Palestinian schools, then they shut down all Palestinian kindergartens. Palestinian education became criminalized and went underground. And the Israeli army would raid churches, mosques, YMCA, community centers, any place where classes were conducted were subject to arrest. And in Beit Sahur, the famous tax revolt during the first Intifada, when they refused for months to pay taxes, and they used the slogan, "No taxation without representation," and even middle-class women who matched their scarves with their shoes participated. And that continued, the criminalization of education. In every curfew, Palestinian school children are prevented from going to school. In this case, Palestinian girls in Al-Khalil, Hebron, were challenging the curfew and trying to go to school, but they were stopped at gunpoint. And all this was a prelude to the Arab Spring, as many of the leaders of the Egyptian, Tunisian, Yemeni, and other popular revolutions in the Arab world tell us that they were extremely inspired by Palestinian civil resistance. And the Arab Spring, in turn, was one of the main inspirations behind the Occupy Wall Street and the Occupy movement in this country, which is really the freshest news we've seen in many, many years. When the US 99% awakens, it's good for humanity. It's good for the world. It is awakening, not yet awake. I wouldn't go that far, but we're getting there, which is great for the world. So Palestinian civil society raised the slogan, "Occupy Wall Street, not Palestine, boycott Israel." As we see our struggle truly as part of the 99% struggling for freedom, justice, and global dignity. So some activists in this country working on race issues, working on permanent felons, as in Chicago, for example, 80% of adult black men in the urban area of Chicago are permanent felons. They're disenfranchised, they're denied legally, they're denied basic rights, as in voting, as in running for certain jobs, and so on and so forth. Apartheid, but a very sophisticated form of apartheid in urban areas in this country. So one activist, I was giving this lecture in Chicago and said, as an artist, what can I do to help the BDS movement? I'm involved in black struggles in this country, Latino struggles and so on. I said, you're already helping our movement. You're already doing it. If you really struggle and create this mass movement that can change US priorities from perpetual wars to investing in healthcare, education, and social benefits, and better jobs for people in this country and the environment, That's good for Palestine, for Lebanon, for Pakistan, for the entire humanity. But what about parity? I mean, some people say, yeah, but we want to be balanced. Especially in this country, actually, more than other places. But anyway. But Nelson Mandela had something to say about this balance and parity. He said, we can easily be enticed to read reconciliation and fairness as meaning parity between justice and injustice. But that would be false and unethical. So people can say, well, you know, I support Palestinian rights, but I like Israel. I'm against the occupation, but I like Israel. Well, that, in the US heritage, imagine in the 1800s, somebody saying, I support the US, but I'm against slavery. That minor little problem you have there. Or somebody saying, I really love South Africa, but I disdain apartheid. I have a problem with it. But it's, you know, in general, I love South Africa otherwise. It would be ridiculous. But in the Israeli case, it's not ridiculous, it's normalized. You hear it every time in your mainstream media, including from liberals. So you always hear, I support Israel, but I'm against the occupation. Well, I have news for you. It's Israel that's doing the occupation. There's no state at the UN called the occupation, which people can punish. It's the state of Israel. In international law, we deal with states. The entity that is responsible. So even if you're such a bigot and you don't give a damn about 62% of the Palestinian people, you only care about the occupation, you would take measures against Israel because it is the occupying power. The economic aspect of BDS is extremely important because many people always jump and say, okay, BDS sounds morally very compelling, but is it effective? Can it have an impact? And of course, people have very short memory. In South Africa, they started in the 1950s, their boycott. Only in the second half of the 1980s did it start truly biting. It took 30 years. The BDS movement is a mere 6-year-old movement. It is way too early to measure impact on such a strong economy as Israel. Despite that, we've had quite a few successes. Veolia, the French company involved in the Jerusalem Light Rail, we started a boycott campaign against it in November 2008. And every few months, Veolia has lost contracts. The total is even more than 12 billion since I wrote this. They lost even more contracts. Just very recently in the UK, they lost a £500 million contract. And these are all BDS campaigns, BDS activists. In Sweden, in Britain, in Ireland, and elsewhere. More than $12 billion. So complicity is carrying a heavier price. Alstom, the other French company involved in the Jerusalem Light Rail, which is an illegal project connecting the settlements to the city of Jerusalem, just lost a contract in November last year of $9.4 billion in Saudi Arabia. And of course, Alstom was saying, oh, this has nothing to do with BDS, until the Saudi Arabian embassy in Cairo issued an official statement saying, we excluded Alstom because it's involved in colonizing East Jerusalem. And Norway. The BDS movement has Israeli partners. From the beginning in the BDS call, we called on conscientious Israelis to join the movement. So, Who Profits, which is a project of the Coalition of Women for Peace, Adala New York, which is of course the pioneering BDS group in this country, and Stop the Wall, which led the BNC groups, in a campaign to pressure the Norwegian government, the Norwegian pension fund specifically, to divest from 2 companies that are implicated in Israel's occupation and violation of human rights. And we succeeded collectively in this effort. It's very important to mention our Israeli partners in this work, in the cultural boycott, in many other aspects. Boycott from Within, which is a main, predominantly Jewish Israeli group of activists that's supporting the BDS movement, ICAD, the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, as I said, the Coalition of Women for Peace, and others started joining the BDS movement, especially since 2009. Agrexco, which was Israel's largest exporter of agricultural produce, went bankrupt. We have reason to believe that BDS played a key role in that, especially in France, where the coalition against Agrexco constitutes 5 national parties. No envy there, they do have national parties. 5 national parties and 95 NGOs together lobbied against Agrexco, so its revenue started dropping in Scandinavia, in France, Britain, Spain, and elsewhere. It played a role, it wasn't the only role. In the trade union movement, from COSATU in South Africa to the Scottish, the Irish trade unions, to the Brazilian CUT, which has 22 million members, to to TUC, the British Trade Union Congress, which has about 6.5 million workers, to other unions in Canada, in France, in Italy, and so on, started joining the BDS movement. When Israel attacked the flotilla and killed 9 humanitarian activists on May 30th, 2010, Palestinian civil society, especially our trade union movement, called on dock workers around the world to stop offloading Israeli ships in response. Besiege Israel siege was our slogan. And indeed, dock workers in Sweden, Kocha, India, Greece, Turkey, South Africa, and even in Oakland, California. For 24 hours, dock workers with a lot of community support managed to delay offloading an Israeli ship for 24 hours. So BDS has crossed the Atlantic. I mean, if we look at the US as the other side of the Atlantic, because in Canada it was always active. But from the US campaign to the Israeli occupation, which is the main coalition of groups working on BDS in this country, among other things that they're doing, to Adala, New York with their subversive Christmas carols, to Code Pink, the famous anti-war group that started here in New York, and with their very famous Ahava campaign. Ahava is an Israeli cosmetics company that uses minerals stolen from occupied Palestinian territory. So Code Pink started this very creative campaign, usually demonstrating in pink bikinis. Here it's black, it's a change of style. And they used the slogan, no Ahava. Ahava in Hebrew means love. No Ahava with occupation. A very brilliant, catchy phrase, and it spread across the world. Just a couple of days ago, it was announced that the agent, the reseller of Ahava in Japan, has stopped carrying Ahava after 2 years of losses. The main point about BDS is it's not an ideology, it's not a political party, it's based on context, sensitivity, and sustainability. So activists everywhere decide what to target and how to target. If you support BDS, it means you support the 3 basic rights: ending occupation, ending apartheid, and supporting the right of return. How you do BDS, it depends on you, on the ground. You can start with one particular product, or you can start with one institution. It depends on you. Israeli Apartheid Week is an excellent example. A lot was said about this, but one thing that was not said is that for the first time, as far as I can tell, in Israel's history, they're sending, now as we speak, 100 emissaries, fully paid by the Israeli Foreign Ministry, to counter Israeli Apartheid Week around the world. 100 paid agents of the State of Israel to counter this supposedly insignificant BDS activity. They're not doing that against Iran, as far as I know. Anyway. And of course, the Olympia Food Co-op, which, as Laura said, we just had a big legal victory today. So today, we proved in court that boycotting Israeli products is not discriminatory and does not violate anyone's rights in this country. And the BDS flash mob, Adala famous flash mob. A church is an ethical investment. That's a very important aspect. The United Methodist Church and the Presbyterians, and I'm getting to the end here, are both having their general assemblies coming up. The Methodists in April and May, and the Presbyterians in July. In both cases, they're debating divestment resolutions. It's extremely important for anyone involved at all with either church to help counter the massive onslaught of lobbying attacks against them. They're really maintaining their ground and taking a very courageous position. And their both divestment campaigns are very selective against American companies profiting from Israel's occupation. So it's not like boycott everything Israeli. They're really doing a very, very targeted campaign in either church. If either church passes their divestment resolution, it will be a game changer for Palestinian rights in this country. We will have crossed from the margins still to the mainstream. Let's really not underestimate what a victory in either case would mean. And the lobby recognizes that. We both are on the same page on that. Until 2009, we did not have a unified Palestinian Christian voice calling for BDS. But that changed with the Kairos Palestine document. It's a theological Christian document that says it's a moral and theological obligation to fight injustice, including through BDS. And as some of you might know, Palestinian Christian denominations hardly agree on anything. Christmas, Easter, they don't agree on anything at all. But on this, we had almost a consensus from representatives of Palestine, all Christian denominations, representatives of them agreed on the Kairos document, which called for BDS among other measures. In 2011, just last year before Christmas, they issued the Bethlehem Call, making it even clearer, making their voice even clearer. And it said, occupation no more, dismantling Israeli apartheid, demanding the right to return. So they explicitly adopted the 3 rights in the BDS movement, very explicitly, and reiterated their support for BDS. And the cartoon says, Intifada, West Bank and Gaza, and it was Jesus kicking the occupation in the butt. Jewish groups. There was always a myth that Israel speaks for all Jews, and all Jews are naturally supporters of Israel. It was always a myth. But it's especially a myth now, when we're seeing a massive support among younger Jews for BDS and for Palestinian rights. I've been touring campuses and churches and elsewhere, and there's a disproportionately high number of Jewish students in every SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine. We're very proud of their support, they're our partners, and together we're fighting for our rights. The Jewish Voice for Peace is leading the biggest campaign in this country, BDS campaign that is, against TIA-CREF, and NYU is active in that, SJP. International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network is leading a campaign against the JNF that Laura explained why it's sinful. American Jews for Justice, and so on. Not in our name seems to be the slogan that they all agree on. Israel does not speak on behalf of Jewish communities here or anywhere else. And pinkwashing. Israel has always used its gay rights to whitewash or pinkwash its violations of international law and Palestinian rights. And thanks to Palestinian activists, Israeli activists, and American queer activists, this is being very well countered. Sarah Schulman, a leading author in the LGBT movement, published an article in the New York Times. I still don't know how she got it published, but which exposed this. The academic and cultural boycott campaign was always a very important part because Israeli academic and cultural institutions are very complicit in Israel's violations. And our main partner in that part of our work is the US campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel. Already Hampshire College in 2009 divested from 6 companies profiting from the occupation. And at Berkeley, we almost succeeded with a majority supporting the divestment, but the president of the student council vetoed, and we did not have the 2/3 majority needed to override that veto. And of course, the UPenn conference, the first national BDS conference in this country, and you heard all the drama about that conference, and the SJP conference at Columbia, and several key cultural figures have really joined the BDS movement, and we're really proud of them. Alice Walker famously said Rosa Parks would have supported BDS to soothe the pain and attend the sorrows of a people wrongly treated for generations. And Angela Davis said, it is not the image of the Israeli government that needs changing, but rather its racist and repressive policies and practices of apartheid. And Naomi Klein, who took a pragmatic dimension and said, boycott is not a dogma, it's a tactic. The reason the strategy should be tried is practical. In a country so small and trade-dependent as Israel, it could actually work. And Roger Waters of Pink Floyd, who said, I'm against Israel for exactly the same reasons that I was against South Africa. It's a 2-tiered racist system. I'm calling on my fellow musicians and artists to join the BDS movement, campaign against Israel, enough is enough. Stefan Messel, a living legend, a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust and co-author of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, said, BDS campaigns around the world present the most promising way to overcome the failure of world governments to stand up to Israel's intransigence and lawless behavior. And Judith Butler, BDS is the only way that citizens can call for the enforcement of international law. So cultural boycott started really spreading, with many, many artists refusing to play Israel. Increasingly, Tel Aviv started looking like Sun City, the resort in South African apartheid that was used to undermine the boycott. So from Gil Scott-Heron to Elvis Costello to the Pixies, Ken Loach, Vanessa Paradis, and even Snoop Dogg refused to play Israel. And when one South African company violated the boycott, Desmond Tutu told them, just as we said during apartheid, that it was inappropriate for international artists to perform in South Africa in a society founded on discriminatory laws and racial exclusivity, so it would be wrong for Cape Town Opera to perform in Israel. So Israel, the establishment, started viewing BDS as, quote, a strategic threat. They're using this term more often nowadays. But at a very basic level, the BDS movement is calling on people of conscience, especially in this country, to do no harm. As Martin Luther King said, withdraw your support for evil. That's what a boycott means. You're withdrawing your support for evil. That's not heroic. It's a profound, fundamental moral obligation. It's not heroic to stop complicity. And this is the very end. Martin Luther King said, change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability, but comes through continuous struggle. And so we must straighten our backs and work for our freedom. A man can't ride you unless your back is bent. And in the BDS movement, our back is anything but bent. We continue to walk straight for freedom, justice, and equality. This is what Mandela and King would have done. Thank you. I'm not ashamed at all to have supported, and I continue to support the one-state solution. But let's look at it this way. One person, one vote. Actually, in one of the pamphlets, Zionist anti-BDS pamphlets, they say the ultimate goal of the BDS movement is a one person, one vote. Ooh. Really? I mean, what's wrong with people? One person, one vote is a disaster for Palestinians and Israelis. That's the ultimate evil that we can have. Equality. And as I've written and said a million times, but I've repeated, did equality and justice destroy South Africa? Did equality and justice destroy Alabama? Why is it only in our case that equality and justice are looked upon as evil, destructive, delegitimizing, and all that other nonsense? Regarding this, and I repeat, in the BDS movement we take no position. And we insist on that. We take no position on one state versus two states. It doesn't have to be a one state to respect our three basic rights. It can and should be honored. Our three basic rights, ending occupation, apartheid, and the right of return should be honored regardless. What people are saying is that, no, but in a two-state solution, their understanding is that Israel gets off the hook and keeps its apartheid system. Well, guess what? Palestinians don't like that idea. We're not particularly interested in maintaining an apartheid system that oppresses us on our indigenous homes. Why would any reasonable person accept an apartheid system that oppresses him or her? They would be absolutely nuts. And Palestinians are not nuts. Believe it or not, we have average intelligence. And MLK, yes, the fabrication is just amazing. Amazing how Zionists can fabricate something he never, ever uttered. There's no reference, and I challenge anyone in this room to bring a reference to when Martin Luther King spoke supporting Zionism. And when Hillel are tweeting to you or Facebook, booking to you, whatever they're doing to you, ask them to send the reference, please. Tel Aviv University, I thought you would be creative by 2012. I mean, for 3-4 years, I've been getting this question in every single panel. I mean, yes, Hillel asks you to ask this, but be creative. Try to give it a twist. Anyway. For your information, Nelson Mandela studied at an apartheid university, because Nelson Mandela was a citizen in the country of South Africa, which is an apartheid system, and he had no choice but to study in an apartheid university. Palestinian citizens and permanent residents of Israel, as taxpayers, are entitled to health services, education services from the apartheid state. That's the only system that we have. Whether it's an apartheid system or not is the issue we're discussing. Whether we have a right to use those services or not is beyond debate. That's the only state that we're dealing with. If we don't use health and education services of the apartheid state, we don't exist. This is all we have. For anyone to claim that since Palestinians are calling for a boycott, are calling for internationals to boycott Israeli universities, Israeli institutions, that they themselves, including Palestinian citizens of Israel and permanent residents of Israel, should do the same, are not being realistic at all. In no other boycott situation can the oppressed under apartheid maintain the same level of boycott. South Africans did not boycott the South African apartheid system. as they called on internationals to boycott it. How could they? How could you have boycotted, if you're a black in South Africa, how could you have boycotted South African companies, universities, or hospitals, or any other service provider? It's impossible. You want us to commit suicide, to die? Or as some people say, why don't you go abroad to study? No, I'm staying home. I fought for my right to go home. I'm not leaving home. Mainstreaming the BDS movement. Thank God we had one question in this. That's a very important question, actually, because in 2012, a main priority for us is mainstream. So the work that's being done at the Presbyterian Church, the Methodist Church, and the TIAA-CREF campaign, all these campaigns are in very mainstream institutions in this country. TIAA-CREF is, I think, the largest pension fund in the US with huge sum of money invested. So a campaign that effectively targets TIAA-CREF, and I'm not saying we're going to achieve this victory tomorrow. This is a process, but so it was in the South African case. It's a process. But we're already trying to get into mainstream campaigns. The point is this broad tent approach. That, as I said earlier, and I'll repeat it, this is not a left exclusivist campaign. It's a really broad tent movement. We should be able to connect. We should be able to build bridges with movements working on every aspect of human rights and human dignity in this country. Minorities, people of color, feminists, LGBT groups, labor, really, we should work with all these groups and establish this broad tent, not in a superficial way. You know, I'll sign your petition, you sign my petition. That's basic. It's really, truly connected. I mean, those struggles are truly connected, and the 1% are very united. So it's time for the 99% to get their head together and unite. This is where we see BDS going, presenting itself and actually building organizational, political alliances and bridges with all movements working for rights in this world.
So, you know, I had the task of talking about law, so I didn't get to out myself. I'd like to out myself less than 30 years, but when I had the capacity to think through this, I've been a supporter of the one-state solution as well. And so for those who have questions about this, the thing here is to maintain a distinction between a movement and the political solution. And I think that the political solution is something that should be left to those who are actually going to live in the land to make that decision. But for those who are interested in understanding why I, as a Palestinian, for example, support the one-state solution and have supported it, there is two major reasons. The first reason is that the two-state solution will not adequately address the distinction and the discrimination against Palestinians within Israel, as I demonstrated through law, nor address the right of return of those Palestinian refugees. And in effect, it'll be creating an abridged solution. It's almost a cosmetic solution so that the world community can rest at night, as opposed to having a comprehensive solution that meets the human rights, the dignity, the freedom of all Palestinians. So that's one reason. But the second reason is, and I wonder to those who are concerned about the one-state solution, and this includes Palestinians as well, is it just about tactics? Do you just think the two-state solution is going to work better? And in that case, can we have a discussion about what is going to work better? For those who are sincerely asking the question, I just think two states makes more sense, then I ask you, what do we do with the 500,000 settlers in the West Bank? What do we do with the annexation wall that now creeps 13% into the West Bank? What do we do with the 40% of the Jordan Valley that's been deemed a military zone by Israel? What do we do with Area C, which is 62% of the West Bank that is under Israeli civilian and military control? What two states? If it's really about two states, then I beg you to show me what two states it was. If it was even a possibility in 1991, it's certainly not a possibility now. And discussion of it, frankly, is one, disingenuous, and it represents how slow the political process in the community of nations lags behind human rights movements. In 1991, the two-state solution was considered apostasy. Today, the one-state solution is considered apostasy, and the two-state solution is the only one. But the political community, which considers it politically expedient, is well behind the curve. And they'll have to catch up to the grassroots human rights movement. And that's the task, that's our task, to pressure states to do that heavy work.
Question for both of you. Mr. Boycott, I've recently gotten interested in BDS. I've always kind of tried not to buy Israeli products, but I haven't ever been able to find a decent list of things I might buy as a consumer. I mean, obviously, I think there are like those codes that they have at the bottom of things, but where can I start finding a list? Because all my BDS friends are like, well, it's more about specific instances, don't buy stuff at home, almost, and all these things. But I'd like a list, and if there is one, I'd like to know about it. And Ms. Boycott, I'm at the law school. This event wasn't even advertised there, which I should take responsibility for because we should be doing things within our schools. But it seems to me that, and I transferred from Michigan, where there was also like nothing to be said about Palestine and the movement for Palestine in the U.S. Can you talk a little bit about being a lawyer in the U.S. and being affiliated with the law school, and kind of the lack of Arab or pro-Palestinian lawyers and kind of what we can do on that front? I mean, it's a broad question, but I'd like to hear.
Ms. Boycott, I think you did a fantastic job of outlining the legal matrix of control that Israel imposes, but I'm wondering what you would suggest as a mechanism or a tool for enforcement for a country that's so long eschewed any use of international law. What good is knowing that they violated if you can't use that against them?
Oh, hi, how are you? Did a great job, thank you very much. I have a couple of questions.
Can we raise it up?
It's hard. I have a couple of questions. So for Jews who support Palestine, what happens when Palestinians win and they take over Israel? What happened with the Jews? And that's a good question. And so all those Palestinian refugees, where they live? I don't really know where they live. Do they live in tents? I mean, whenever I think about refugees, I think about tents. Do they live for 60 years in tents? It's kind of weird. And where do they live? I mean, what countries where they live, And how do other countries, if I heard that they live in Lebanon, you said Syria, Jordan. And what happens to those people? How they live there? Are they treated well? Is Israel more apartheid than Syrian government or Lebanese government or Jordanian government? And I read some stuff that in Islam and Arab countries, how you call it?
Bullshit.
Careful.
Can I ask a question? Lesbianism and gay is illegal. So why is it kind of, how does LGBT go with supporting Israel? Thank you. That's a question I want to know. Is it Q&A?
Those are great questions, and we should have this conversation. So thank you for your question.
Two things. You guys ever consider a BDS campaign against Lebanon? I'd like you to maybe comment on how the Palestinians are being treated there. And right of return. My mother's Iraqi. Half her family was slaughtered because they were Jewish. Family settled in Israel. My Saba, to his dying day, wanted to go back to Iraq. There were hundreds of thousands, almost a million Arab refugees, Jewish refugees who were forced out of their countries, who never even whispered about right of return. I'd love to hear a comment on that.
I'm going to the bathroom. I'm going to go really quick because I also have to catch a train. So I'm not going to stay with you. I'll leave you with one. But let me try to do this really quick. Lawyers in the U.S. No. So The legal profession is one of the most conservative. The legal academia is even more conservative. And so if you think, a friend of mine, so I teach at graduate students, but I don't teach on law schools yet. And so one of my great friends who's an NYU alum, and he's a Guantanamo Bay defense attorney, says to me, you know, you teaching at a law school is like Hollywood making a film about Deir Yassin. So just to give you an idea how we can work, and this is related to your question of what the law that corresponds to remedies that goes with violations. So the idea is this: there's a lot of ways that we can use the law. There's the International Court of Justice, there's the International Criminal Court. There's delegations like the one that I participated in with the National Lawyers Guild to visit Gaza in the aftermath of Operation Cast Lead, to document all those violations and come and build a legislative campaign around Arms Export Control Act compliance. There's universal jurisdiction to actually sue Israeli soldiers who visit Europe where universal jurisdiction exists in national legislation. In the US, there's something called the Alien Tort Statute, which affords US-based attorneys to sue Israeli officials, and we did do that. We sued Avi Dichter and Moshe Ya'alon, DC District Court, Southern District Court of New York. Both were dismissed, but both were dismissed on political grounds and not on legal ones, for that this was better in the purview of the executive as opposed to the judicial branch. So this goes to your question. So what about the law if you can't do anything about it? The truth is that because Israel is afforded protection by the US, it means that law and politics is inseparable. And so we can't give up on the law. And that actually has to be central to any campaign that we build, along with BDS, as part of a broader strategy, because even BDS is not a strategy. It's part of a tactic and a broader strategy. The legal approach is one piece of it, but it's useless without the political organizing. It's useless. It's useless without the political organizing. It's useless without lobbying on Capitol Hill, where you can't talk about Palestinian rights. I work for BOYCOTT. Do you know what it's like going onto the Hill, introducing myself as part of a Palestinian refugee organization? On the Hill, even to the best members of Congress, it's as if I told them Israel doesn't have the right to exist, because I said the words Palestinian refugee. So it's about being creative. How do these various tactics actually blend with one another and work together in a broader campaign? And so work on your law degree, be a great human rights advocate, but also I encourage everybody, lawyer, engineer, judge, whatever, also be a part of the BDS movement. They just don't work without the other. I had the question about Jewish Iraqis returning to Iraq. And so here, I just want to say that this isn't a case specific. This isn't about, you know, the exclusive nature or the exceptional nature of Palestinian refugees. All refugees have the right to return. I hope that nothing we said here, negates your family, your future children if you choose to have them, your relatives, from ever returning. But these rights are not mutually exclusive. Palestinians returning to their homelands does not negate the right of Iraqi Jews, of Iranian Jews, of Yemeni Jews, of Syrian Jews, of Moroccan Jews, from all returning to their homelands in a Middle East where one country's rights are not prioritized at the expense of every other people and every other country. The idea is that